Philip T. Hoffman begins his 2015 book, Why Did Europe Conquer the World?, discussing a time machine. Imagine, he writes, that you had a time machine that could carry you back to the year 900 for an extended stay. Where in the world would you go to live? His advice that you should avoid Western Europe at all costs. Why reside there, he says, when it is poor, violent, politically chaotic, by almost every yardstick hopelessly backward? There were no cities apart from Cordova, but that was part of the Muslim world. Luxuries, silks, perfume, and spices were scarce and extremely expensive. To get them, they had to trade with the Middle Eastern merchants and sell the few Western goods they deigned to purchase, such as furs or slaves. And if you were not careful, if, say, you wandered down to the beach in Italy, you yourself might be captured and delivered into slavery. Choosing Europe would, in short, be like opting to move to Afghanistan today. You'd be far better off, he says, picking the Muslim Middle East, which is richer and more advanced, culturally and technologically. It had cities, markets brimming with goods from around the world, from Indian sandalwood to Chinese ceramics, and scholars who were extending works of ancient Greek science that were still unknown in Western Europe. Or southern China, where political regimes would soon stabilize, allowing agriculture to advance and trade in tea, silk, and porcelain to flourish. Western Europe had nothing promising on the horizon, only continued raids by the marauding Vikings. If you let your time machine lift forward, however, to the year 1914, you'd be startled to discover that the Europeans had taken over the world, controlling 84% of the globe. Niall Ferguson, in his TV series and book Civilization, the West and the Rest, 2011, drops our time traveler not in Europe in the year 900, but in the early 15th century, which he describes in no less unflattering and unappealing ways. Europe is a miserable backwater, backward and plagued by bad sanitation and incessant war and violence, recovering from the ravages of the Black Death, with a low standard of living and a short lifespan. Quoting the much later political philosopher Hobbes, he says that life at this time was poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. The place to be, Ferguson believes, was China and the Yongle Emperor, the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty, who ruled from 1402 to 1424. Not only was China a rich, populous, prosperous, and peaceful country, whose cities dwarfed those of Western Europe in size, splendor, and cleanliness, but already produced a host of innovations. To mention just a few of them, we have paper, gunpowder, printing with movable type, mechanical clocks, matches, even the toothbrush. Also in the Yongle Emperor, we see the preeminence of China in the great treasure fleets of ocean-going junks of the Admiral Zheng He. He voyaged to Java, India, Arabia, and East Africa, manifesting Chinese power and collecting tribute. And all of this 18 years before Henry the Navigator even began his voyages of discovery. Yet, as Ferguson tells us, well, in 1500 the future imperial powers of Europe accounted for 5% of the world's surface and 16% of its population. By 1913, they controlled 3/5 of all territory and population, and 74% of global economic output. As Ferguson emphasizes, the rise of Western civilization is the single most important historical phenomenon of the second half of the second millennium after Christ. He asks, what was it about the civilization of Western Europe after the 15th century allowed it to trump the outwardly superior empires of the Orient. Clearly, he believes, it was something more than the beauty of the Sistine Chapel. What was it? Jared Diamond and his Guns, Germs, and Steel, 1997, so that the West's advantage was in its geography, its natural boundaries breaking up Europe into smaller, more competitive states, in its gunpowder technology, and its immunity to diseases that would wipe out native peoples. Certainly, disease devastated the Americas, but these Middle Eastern and Asian civilizations were equally immune from diseases that destroyed the American Indians. And geography did not cause the monolithic empires like China, since they too had their share of natural boundaries. Nor were these civilizations technologically backward. Philip T. Hoffman asks, why were the Europeans the ones who ended up subjugating the world? Why not the Chinese, the Japanese, the Ottomans from the Middle East, or South Asians? All at one time or another could boast of powerful civilizations, and unlike Africans, Native Americans, and inhabitants of the Australia and Pacific Islands, they all had access early on to the same weapons the Europeans used. If you go back into the past, they would seem to be stronger candidates than the Europeans. So why did they end up in control? Why indeed? Some point to industrialization as the cause. The Industrial Revolution, they say, began in Europe and gave Europeans tools from repeating rifles to steam-powered gunboats that assured them of military supremacy. And with that, world conquest was easy. But as Hoffman points out, in 1800, when Europe already held sway over 35% of the globe, and their ships dominated the world trade, the Industrial Revolution had scarcely begun in Britain, and not yet even touched Europe. While Paul Kennedy and his influential The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, 1987, saw military competition as a cause of Europe's military innovation, Hoffman reminds us that ongoing military rivalry does not always promote innovation. It must be an extraordinary military rivalry, one under certain conditions. He gives 4 conditions for this. A. That the wars must be frequent, and for a prize valuable enough when compared with the fixed costs of establishing a fiscal system and a military apparatus. Nor can there be a vast difference between the countries in size, economies, or in their ability to borrow. B. That these wars must not only be frequent, but also be lavishly funded. C. The gunpowder technology must be used heavily in these wars, and not older military technologies. D. That there should be few obstacles to adopting these military innovations, even by opponents. Only in Western Europe, he believes, were these conditions met. On the whole, I think Hoffman is right. But this only accounts for why Europe militarily conquered the world. European ascendancy, however, was not just military or in territory. Europe has conquered the world in almost every way possible, intellectually, politically, culturally, even in style, dress, and the way people eat, so that even with the loss of colonial empires, even as the West declines relatively speaking to the rest of the world in population and economic productivity, the West still sets the pace for everything, quite literally everything. It still remains a kind of model for the way the rest of the world wants to organize itself. As Ferguson says so well, with every passing year, more and more human beings shop like us, study like us, stay healthy or unhealthy like us, and pray or don't pray like us. Burgers, Bunsen burners, Band-Aids, baseball caps, and Bibles. You cannot easily get away from them, wherever you go. One could say it was just by dumb luck, a mere roll of the dice by which Europe got there first, sometimes by chance breaks, and that once you are first by your military power, the advantage is yours in everything else, and you remain as first. If things had happened differently, this had happened there, and that had not happened here, and that person had lived another 20 years, and that person had died in a cradle, it would all have been different. And there's some truth in that. Perhaps it is so. I do believe that human nature is the same everywhere, even if cultures are not, and that historical events are contingent. At many critical junctures, different choices could have been made. Human intentionality is important. As Al Pacino says so well in The Devil's Advocate, that wonderfully over-the-top movie of the 1990s, free will, it is a bitch. But free will is always informed, if not determined, by cultural and institutional factors, by the things around us. The truth of the matter is that something did happen in the West that did not happen elsewhere. Some have called it the European miracle. And certain cultural and institutional factors helped inform those choices. Nor is military power the magic key to everything else. But not only did the West get there first, but has remained so even as military power declined, right until the present. I cannot believe that it was merely material considerations and dumb luck that led to the West's rise. There must be something more. Ferguson has his own list of reasons of why the West conquered the rest, what he calls the 6 killer apps. They are competition, science, property rights, medicine, the consumer society, and the work ethic. I find these persuasive. Ferguson, himself an atheist, also seems to recognize cultural and even religious element to all this. In his book, he refers to what a member of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences said about the rise of the West. The scholar said, "One of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact the preeminence of the West all over the world. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next we focused on your economic system. But the past 20 years we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this." Ferguson then quotes another scholar, the director of the World Religion Research Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who points to the Christian understanding of transcendence as being decisive in the acceptance of pluralism in the contemporary West. He said, "Only by accepting this understanding of transcendence as our criterion can we understand the real meaning of such concepts as freedom, human rights, tolerance, equality, democracy, the rule of law, universality, and environmental protection." While Ferguson did not continue on this point, it is worthwhile to mention that these Chinese scholars are not the only ones who have seen the integral importance of Christianity for the core ideals of the West. Marcello Pera, an Italian academic, one-time professor of the philosophy of science at the University of Pisa in Catania, from 2001 to 2006, president of the Italian Senate, wrote in his 2008 book, Why We Should Call Ourselves Christians, defending Christianity as the core of Europe and the guardian of its liberal values. Himself an agnostic and a disciple of classical European liberalism, with all its detachment from organized religion of any sort, he believed that liberalism could not have existed without Christianity, and will not exist with its demise. As he writes, "Without faith in the equality, dignity, liberty, and responsibility of all men, that is to say, without a religion of man as the son and image of God, which is the essence of Judeo-Christian religion, liberalism cannot defend the fundamental, universal rights of human beings, or hope that human beings can coexist in a liberal society. A condition is necessary if liberals are to preserve the core of their doctrine. Basic human rights must be seen as a gift of God, to use Jefferson's phrase. They must be understood as properties of men, as human beings, rather than as citizens, a possession not at the mercy of legislators, but prior to their laws, and hence pre-political and non-negotiable. These rights must be religiously cherished. The liberal ethos derives from the idea that we are children created in the image of the Christian God, who has given us truth and freedom, autonomy, and the duty to fulfill his will. The list of liberal values is long and includes loyalty, honesty, credibility, tolerance, respect, justice, benevolence, and so on. All these dispositions are necessary to maintain an open, tolerant, and respectful society. These are typical Christian virtues that we find in Scripture and the Magisterium. If you take them away from liberalism, it loses its lifeblood. The liberal, he says, is a Christian, even when he does not know it. Supernatural is therefore the protector of the natural, or to put it differently, while these values could be known by reason alone, by natural law, for most of us it is revelation that will best preserve and protect them. As Karl Popper, perhaps the greatest philosopher of science of the 20th century, once said in his Open Society and Its Enemies, I too believe that our Western civilization owes its real rationalism, its faith in the rational unity of man and the open society, and especially its scientific outlook, to the ancient Socratic and Christian belief in the brotherhood of all men, and also in intellectual honesty and responsibility. While Ferguson himself does not go this far, he does open himself to its possibility, and certainly his 6 killer apps make somewhat better sense in the context of the Christian history of Europe. Competition. Competition is certainly one of the reasons why Europe triumphed. Not only was Europe not dominated by a single power, it was broken down into many competing powers. Even within single states, there were competing corporate entities. Ecclesiastical entities such as monasteries, canneries, religious orders, dioceses and parishes, as well as communes and incorporated towns, guilds, confraternities, and so on, all self-regulating and self-governing, as well as various noble orders, and all were bound by traditional liberties and customs. There was no idea of an absolute monarch in the Christian Middle Ages, and there was always an idea of the 2 powers, the 2 swords, not a fusion and a sacred monarchy. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. And while we have this image of a golden harmony of church and state, of the 3 estates of the clergy, nobility, and commoners between each other, and with their superiors and inferiors, there was in fact frequent, almost never-ending conflict of church versus state, king versus nobility, nobility versus nobility, and so on. With the revival of trade and growth of cities, with the growth of banks, international finance, and credit, there was even more competition. And while Europe was united in the Catholic faith, and under the authority of the Pope, did not stop Christian Europe from division and conflict, a conflict that was increased at the Reformation, when it divided Western Europe into Catholic and Protestant, and then varieties of Protestant. While all this was far from the pluralism of our contemporary world, it is still a pluralism of sorts, left an opening and a possibility for greater pluralism. Science. That science transformed the world is not surprising, but that science did not begin with the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, nor was it alien to the Christian faith. It had its roots in the Christian Middle Ages, and the great figures of the scientific revolution were themselves believers. There has always been those who are attracted to a blind faith, to a literalist fundamentalism, which ignores reason and secular knowledge. On the whole, that is what you saw in the Christian history. From its earliest years, Christianity attracted learned men who, believing that man was made by the divine Logos, created reason itself, in the image and likeness of God, sought to penetrate the depths of God and the world. Faith seeking understanding, as St. Anselm wrote. The respected historian of science, Edward Grant, sees Christianity not only as supporter of science, but the Christian Middle Ages laying the foundations for the scientific revolution. Not only was a massive translation movement of Greek and Arabic texts in Latin encountering them, there was also institutionalization of science in medieval universities, whose curriculum was fundamentally scientific. We also see the industrial and agricultural revolutions of the Middle Ages, the development of the new machines in scientific farming. Despite the humanist critique of scholastic learning, as we see, for example, in Galileo's brilliant, if tendentious, dialogue on the 2 chief world systems, scholasticism remained creative deep into the 17th century, and was in many respects the seedbed for the scientific revolution. Medicine. Modern medicine is certainly another cause of the triumph of the West. Our expansion and understanding of disease and its treatment is not the result of just the application of reason to reality, which we see in other spheres, nor just a response to the frequent outbreaks of disease that have been the lot of man. It is also a result of the Christian concern for the sick. While the ancient world certainly had its doctors, in no culture were the weak, the sick, the indigent given such extensive attention and care as in the Christian one. Jesus himself cured the sick, commanded others to do so. Go, preach, and heal the sick. Jesus himself told his disciples, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Christians impressed the pagan world with their care of the sick, even for those who were not kith and kin to them, even to those who did not share their faith. In the Christian Middle Ages and after, we see the extensive creation of hospitals, the development of religious orders to care for the sick. Property rights. Property rights are not just the concern of the Victorian middle class. For the medieval scholastics, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, also defended them strongly as a consequence of natural law and necessary for human flourishing. Aquinas, himself a mendicant friar, believed that people tend to things far better if they own them, that ownership promotes greater order, since responsibility can be established, that private property promotes greater peace, since quarrels are more common where there is no division of ownership. And the same Pope who canonized St. Thomas Aquinas also condemned the spiritual Franciscans for their exaltation of poverty. Consumerism. Even consumerism, if rightly understood, is a good thing. If consumerism is a view that reduces people just to what they buy and consume, then it's the worship of mammon and should be abhorred. The desire to live a better life is part of our very nature. We were created for happiness. While Christianity is an ascetic, self-denying religion, or to the fullness of human happiness in God, it is not an unnatural, world-denying one, indifferent to lesser goods of God's creation. As Hilaire Belloc once wrote, "Wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine." If one is looking for the Protestant work ethic, it can be found long before the Reformation in the medieval monks who labored to transform the wilderness of Europe, were influential in its industrial and agricultural revolution, and also in the Italian and Flemish merchants, who topped their ledgers with the phrase, "for God and profit." The history of every place and time is of interest, but study of modern European history particularly so, since it offers us a better understanding of our own world. Any study of history will include every aspect, not just its political events, but its art and culture, its philosophy and religion, its highs and lows, even its darkest secrets. It should be an interesting ride, so buckle up as we begin The Great Theater of the World, a History of Modern Europe.